Welcome everybody to NetThing 2020. My name is Melody and I will be your MC for today. You are now joining us for our fourth panel, Gaming Our Future, Emerging Technology and the Future of Internet in Australia. If you are just joining us, welcome. We've had an average of around 60 to 70 attendees so far, and it looks like this number is climbing as we speak. Before we begin, I have 4 things to remind you. All sessions are recorded and live streamed to YouTube. Be mindful of our code of conduct published on netthing.org.au and also in the Zoom chat. If you're feeling confident today, how about sharing a photo of you joining us from home or your office on Twitter using hashtag NetThing2020 or hashtag NetThing by checking out the photo booth selfie provided by our sponsor GoDaddy Registry. Link is in the Zoom chat if you would like to check out that photo booth. For this panel, if you have any questions or comments during the session, use the Q&A button to type your questions and our moderator will read them out. Or for anything that's not related to the panel, use the Zoom chat box for us, especially for the moderator to help you. And also, if you're feeling a little bit more confident, do raise your hand. We do welcome audible questions for our panel as well. That's all from me. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Kelsey Nevin. Kelsey will introduce our panelists. So Kelsey, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone and also your panelists?
Absolutely. Thanks, Melody. And thanks everyone for tuning in to join us for the first online NetThing Australia. It's really exciting and there's been a big lead up amongst the entire steering committee to get here. So this particular session is on emerging technologies and the future of the internet. And as NetThing is a multi-stakeholder event around issues that are relevant to all Australians, we wanted to start to look now and into the future about what emerging technologies are potentially relevant to internet users and what this could mean. So I'm joined by a phenomenal panel and I'm going to allow them to actually kind of give a few minutes introduction of each of themselves, and then we'll have a discussion for around 45 minutes and would love your kind of questions throughout, and we'll spend the last 15 minutes or so on Q&A and finish at 3:30. So I'm going to start by throwing to Associate Professor Marta Poblet from RMIT. Can you please give a few words about yourself and your work?
Yes, thanks, Kelsey, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me in this very interesting panel session. My name is Marta Poblet, and I am an associate professor at the Graduate School of Business and Law at RMIT University, and a principal research fellow at Blockchain Innovation Hub at the same university. Prior to that, I co-founded the Institute of Law and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and I would say that for the last probably 20 years, I've been working at the intersection between law, technology, and governance, and also dispute resolution. So initially from internet semantic web perspective, how semantic web services would enhance the delivery of legal services, for example. And more recently, I became very interested in the technologies such as crowdsourcing and digital platforms for the betterment of democracy and digital democracy. And obviously, in my role at the Blockchain Innovation Hub, how an emergent technology such as the blockchain can contribute to that aspect of improving digital democracy.
Thank you, Marta. Professor Ellie Rennie.
Hi, thanks, Kelsey. Yeah, so I'm a professor at RMIT as well. I work across the Digital Ethnography Research Centre and the Blockchain Innovation Hub, where Marta and Kelsey both work and live. My research over many years was focused on digital inclusion, so looking at internet infrastructures and the opportunities that arise through internet use. However, I'm currently also focused on distributed technologies, in particular blockchain. I think probably one way to think about this area So there was a terrific book called Drone Theory. I don't know if anyone's read that, by Gregoire Chemeu. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, French philosopher. And he talks about the ways in which drones changed the rules of warfare. So it's not that we necessarily, when we take on new technologies or start creating and using new technologies, that they determine what happens to us, but when they arise, they bring new actions into the realm of possibility, and they also bring new ideas about what we can do and how we can do them. And of course, drones are a particularly sinister way of thinking about how technologies have transformed life and death and warfare. But distributed technologies, I think, raise some pretty fundamental questions about the internet, how we use it, and what's possible.
Brilliant framework for the rest of the conversation here about how technology changes the rules. Thanks, Ellie. Chloe White.
Hi, Kelsey. Great to be here. I am the government's National Blockchain Roadmap Lead. So what that means is that I'm responsible for the day-to-day implementation of the government's blockchain roadmap that was launched earlier this year, just prior to COVID. It's a 5-year roadmap and is the first blockchain roadmap that the government has had. I've been in the public service for about 8 or 9 years, advising government on a range of different policy issues. My educational background is in economics and public policy. So I've put that into practice through about 5 or 6 different government portfolios. But I suppose that what they all have in common is this idea that we have these really complex problems to solve in society, and it's not clear that any one individual or organisation owns the problem. And that theme has permeated through so much of the discussion today, and I'm really glad to hear that blockchain's already come up in some of the conversations, and I think that there's a lot of different threads there to potentially tie together, so maybe we'll cover some of that today. But essentially my role, so for the past 3 years, I've been working on blockchain policy advising up until the roadmap was launched. That was within the Council of Financial Regulators context, looking at things like cryptocurrency and stable coins and that sort of thing. But the blockchain roadmap is really much broader than that. It cuts across all the different sectors of the economy, and so certainly relevant to the internet and all the issues that we've been discussing so far at NetThing.
Beautiful. And then last but not least, we're joined by Dr. Mark Chung from University of Melbourne. Mark.
Thanks for having me, Kelsey, and thanks to the whole panel for taking part in this. So it's an honor speaking with Marta and Chloe and Ellie. So by background, I'm a computer scientist, but now you would probably call me a data scientist because the terminology has shifted many times now. I actually was one of the early pioneers in doing Twitter research back in the early 2010s, looking at things like how metadata can be used to look at statistics and demographic patterns, etc. Then basically around a few years ago, I jumped to the other side. So from science to the humanities, I started doing philosophy in looking at how we can approach research on social networks from the individual perspective. So existentialist philosophy I started with, and with some colleagues, so Professor Mark Alfano and Adam Carter, we looked at how social media can be used in, this is really pessimistic, sorry for a pessimistic start, how social media can be used to radicalize people and what tech companies do about it. So I've been looking at both sides of the fence, really, from the tech and the philosophical angle. And now in my current job, I'm a digital ethicist at the Center of AI and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne. And now we're looking at basically AI from a wider perspective. So things like inherent gender bias in natural language models to biases in, for example, gender representation in the computer sciences and information technology fields. So yep, looking forward to have a really good conversation with everyone. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thank you. So to frame this conversation, it might be helpful for everyone tuning in to kind of give a quick summary, I guess, of what these emerging technologies that we're talking about are. So obviously we're not going to touch on everything, but we've got some quite deep expertise represented. So Mark, I might throw back to you around AI, ML and data analytics. And then we'll move to someone else to talk about blockchain next, and we can see what else we want to cover off.
Sure. Thanks, Kelsey. So I actually prepared for this. I've looked through some key textbooks to find out what the best definitions of these terms are. And I think there are two authoritative sources I am consulting for this. So first of all is artificial intelligence, AI, ML, fancy buzzwords, right? So AI is mainly nothing more than, I'm paraphrasing here, how machines can mimic human thinking in solving problems, really. This is from Russell and Norvig, a textbook used in artificial intelligence research for many, many, many years. So from the experts themselves. So what is ML? So if AI is just mimicking human thinking to solve problems, what's ML, as in what's the whole new wave of research in ML about? So machine learning is this from paraphrasing again from a book by Burkhoff. So the 100-page machine learning handbook. It's a practitioner's guide to the state of the art in machine learning. What it really means is we're finding a math formula to solve a problem given certain inputs. So for example, predicting house prices, that's one of the quintessential examples. So in other words, just looking up a formula to solve for some outputs given certain inputs. And why is it interesting in this day and age to have things like data analytics? Because we have another concept again, big data, because now data is generated at a fast pace. If you use Facebook, you use Google, use the COVID Safe app, for instance, or you check into a restaurant, hopefully in stage 2 when we can go back to restaurants again here at Melbourne, we're generating lots of data. And the technologies we have nowadays at processing it have grown by leaps and bounds. Even graphics cards you use for video games can be used to implement deep neural networks, like fancy techniques to make sense of this data. So yep, it is a very interesting time we live in. So yep, back to you, Kelsey.
All right, we might get Chloe on blockchain, Ellie on automation, and then Marta on kind of participatory or digital democracies and kind of bringing some of these concepts together. So Chloe.
Thanks, Kelsey. I think the challenge with some of these emerging technologies like blockchain is that they can be whatever you want them to be. And I think with blockchain, particularly where it's at in its maturity cycle, is beauty is really in the eye of the beholder when it comes to blockchain. So the framework that I would propose for a way of thinking about blockchain, which is extremely diverse, is at the narrow end, you can think about blockchain as essentially like a business improvement software. So it might mean that you have a little more robustness around how you store data in your value chain, for example. And so that's, I suppose, the most boring application or the most simple application that I can think of. And that's where we tend to talk about things like supply chains, you know, for example, in a provenance track and trace kind of way. At the other end of the extreme, you know, blockchain can be thought of as a governance architecture, where essentially you're outsourcing governance to a protocol or some code, and there's some consensus around all the participants in that network, basically agreeing that they all have that one rule set that they want to follow. And so that governance architecture can be applied to many different networks, and it can involve people who may not necessarily want to trust each other, or maybe for legal reasons cannot share information or trust each other because of competition law, for example. And so some of the innovations that can spur from that way of thinking about blockchain might be something like, you know, the Bitcoin network, obviously, where you can have global peer-to-peer transactions that settle very quickly compared to like Swift in the legacy system, you know, with people who don't necessarily know each other. So that's quite a phenomenal use case for blockchain, or something like a DAO. So DAOs, that stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And that's really interesting because it kind of calls into question, from a legal point of view, what does it mean to be a business or to be a company or organization if the business lives completely on the internet and is governed by code, where there's no clearly identifiable, accountable person who's operating that. And how that is coming into play now is through things like decentralized exchanges, where it's not only a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin that's being traded, but rather than it being traded directly peer-to-peer, it's being traded over a decentralized platform. So the possibilities are really endless when it comes to blockchain. the most simple way that I think I can explain it to anyone who's not familiar is to think about it as a method for structuring a database, where essentially that method will involve some cryptography and some kind of incentive system to make sure that everybody in the network acts according to the rules.
Nice. So starting to touch on a few interesting themes there around trust and sort of technical decentralization and also political decentralization and governance, which is the perfect segue to Ellie.
So automation is a very broad category. What's interesting about automation, I suppose, from the field that I work in, a field which has traditionally studied people and their practices, is what are we looking at when a lot of the actions in the world are being conducted by these autonomous machine agents? So how does that change what we do, the skills we need, our, I suppose, processes, our organizations, as Chloe's already started to talk about? So automation and automated decision-making, it can be AI or ML, it can be something like recommender systems. In blockchain, it's getting pretty interesting with some of the decentralized exchanges that Chloe's talking about, because we often talk about particularly the Ethereum platform as being quite transformative because it has these things called smart contracts, which are essentially ways of programming blockchains in a way, say with a vending machine, you know, you put $1 in and something, you know, candy or Coke or something comes out. You can essentially decide to code blockchains in ways where you're going to automate a certain process on that blockchain. And smart contracts have pre-existed, that they were around before blockchains. It's not just about blockchains. But what that does when you're talking about distributed technologies and you're starting to have these automated processes is when, in my view, we're not just talking about peer-to-peer anymore. When I give you, Kelsey, you know, a Satoshi or a Bitcoin, that's a peer-to-peer transaction. You know, it's you and I exchanging without the need for a bank, an intermediary in this case. But when we start talking about things like decentralized exchanges, they're basically like they're essentially running order books, but in a whole new way. They use these things called automated market makers, which use algorithms to determine the price at which you're going to purchase the particular token that you want to buy. But what's interesting is that that's achieved, that price is achieved by many people within this distributed system, providing liquidity into that pool, which enables the algorithm to decide what the price, the value of that particular token is at that time. So we talk about smart contracts, we think about peer-to-peer technologies, but in fact, really what's starting to emerge in blockchain is probably more what we'd call peer-to-contract technology. So where it's me interacting with a pool of other people's interactions. And that is then automated by an algorithm to, in this case, spit out a price, but could potentially be used in all kinds of ways as these technologies, which are currently very early stage as they develop and become the infrastructures of the future internet. So I think we tend to think about automation and AI as this thing which is external to ourselves, as something which is happening, which is a practice which is occurring by machines, by these external agents. But that's not necessarily true. They're things that are interacting with us. And I think that that relationship between our own actions and these automated processes is potentially going to become more entwined, not less, as these things develop.
Yeah, I really like that lens around new structures. And I think the phrasing you used in a recent piece on kind of like human machine sort of interactions and kind of trying to study what this means is really valuable. So Marta, on kind of new structures and, you know, data in society and, you know, democratic society specifically, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I would continue in the line of what just Ellie said about this complex interplay between people using technologies and creating complex relations and emerging properties out of it. So you can see that happening again in the space of participatory democracy and activism. And as my colleagues in the humanitarian field usually say, it's the best technology sometimes in a crisis is the one that you are already using. And it's not that the case that people will jump into the latest thing in those situations. So think, for example, back in 2003-4, where there was no Facebook, nor Twitter, no social media as we know it today, people would use SMS to coordinate in participatory processes. Philippines, Spain, there were no Google Maps either. They came a bit later, or Bing or Apple Maps. So if you remember, a few years later, people started to use those digital maps in mashups. That was the label of the term, to project onto physical coordinates and digital coordinates events that were happening. So I remember, for example, in 2008, activists in Kenya monitoring the election using a mashup of Google Maps and a data set, and people sending SMS to that platform. And that's how Ushahidi was created, out of this merging of technologies. So then obviously came social media, 2004, Facebook, a few some time later, Twitter, and so on. Initially, those platforms were not conceived for political participation or participatory democracy, right? But the beautiful things about technology is that they are constantly repurposed for other things. So they ended up being channels for political participation as well. The issue with that is that while they expanded enormously the range for political participation and debate and contributions from large audiences, at the same time they introduce what we are currently facing, all these predominant misinformation, the emergence of fake news, all types of issues that hamper political participation in those platforms. So the moment is very interesting, I would say, because we at the same time we have those mainstream mediums of participation with all these issues. We've been also witnessing the emergence of other more civic technology platforms that are perhaps born with purpose to address those particular issues of repurposing tools for political debate in a more meaningful and participatory way. So the emergence of civic technologies over the past few years has been staggering. And if you look at how many apps, platforms, and tools people are using at the moment, it's quite staggering. So we may wonder what the future may look like in terms of digital democracy, whether we will have, again, all these distributed landscape of technologies that are available, or rather that we will keep seeing the predominance of mainstream social media for that purpose. It's all very open, but it's very interesting because, again, it's people recombining technologies such as the blockchain now for things that were not perhaps initially thought of.
Thanks, Marta. So I think we've covered off on so new tools and this kind of idea around, okay, well, this changes the rules around how people in technology interact with technology itself and each other in society. And I'd really love to open up the conversation, so we don't have to keep it formal. Feel free to respond to each other, but just to kind of delve a little bit deeper into some of the opportunities this is creating, and then also some of the challenges and how we might kind of think about, either studying to understand or navigating either of those. So Ellie, I might throw back to you and then just kind of like let it flow from there.
I think there are so many opportunities when it comes to distributed technologies. One of the projects that I'm working with at the moment is called the Trust Alliance, and that involves a number of humanitarian organisations spearheaded by Red Cross Australia. What I find really interesting about that project is that it's enabling these humanitarian organisations to coordinate in new ways. Specifically, what they are doing is they're using blockchain, they're using these decentralized systems to enable volunteers or contingent workforce within the humanitarian sector to be able to, an individual to be able to say, show that they have a credential from Red Cross, say it's a first aid qualification, that in an emergency context, they can then go to another NGO that's working in that field, say it's the Country Fire Authority or someone in a bushfire context, and quickly show them that Red Cross has issued this trusted credential, which means that they can be onboarded a lot more rapidly. The response can be faster in that situation. And also the people for whom they are trying to help are protected. You know, these might be vulnerable people. You want to know that the people who are helping them are not kind of bad people who have various forms of misconduct in their past. So what is actually occurring in that scenario, which sounds pretty basic, but it is enabling organizations to work effectively. It's enabling them to work more efficiently as well. But I think for me, what's most interesting is the cooperation that emerges in that situation. So when I think about opportunities of these technologies, what we're really thinking about, I think Nick Szabo, one of the, early Bitcoiners, who's deeply problematic person in terms of his public opinions, but has written some interesting stuff on blockchain. He talks about social scalability. And we created institutions in order to enable us to transact with each other to overcome this problem of trust. So we created things like laws and, even education systems and the rest of it to enable us to know who we can deal with in a certain circumstance and to do so safely. As technologies start to perform those roles, which is exactly what blockchain was designed to do, it means that different players will be able to coordinate better. Hopefully, that's the proposition. And it all could go horribly wrong. But for me, the opportunity will be seeing what arises in those situations when it becomes easy for an organization to spin up an activity. It's something which previously they couldn't, particularly in a context where there are no infrastructures or the social system is inherently broken, where they can come in and provide services. That's the kind of opportunity that I think is exciting.
Could I build on what Ellie just said? Because I think the example that she highlighted there is a really important one that is worth paying attention to. When we talk about opportunities with blockchain, I think sometimes the discussion, it tends to take place in terms of transactions on a blockchain. But what Ellie is talking about here is this fantastic project with the Red Cross, where we're not necessarily talking about rows of transaction data. We're talking about people's credentials. And that's really interesting because in the panel before this, where we were talking about cybersecurity, there was a great discussion about whether blockchain is or isn't a good technology to enable better cybersecurity. And I guess one way to think about that is rather than thinking about putting access records on a blockchain, is to actually put access authorization on a blockchain in a very similar way to what Ellie's just spelled out with credentials for volunteer work. There could be credentials for someone who can manipulate or operate a system in a particular way. So recently we had the Twitter hack, which obviously got a lot of attention, and there was some Bitcoin that was stolen in that process. And there was some frustration in the Bitcoin and blockchain community, and the community came out and said, hey, this isn't a Bitcoin problem. Blockchain actually could have prevented this attack from taking place. And so recognizing that being one of the big opportunities, what we're doing under the National Blockchain Roadmap is we're actually establishing a working group to look at blockchain as an enabling technology for cybersecurity use cases. And it's not just a working group full of blockchain hardcore fans. We're also bringing in people from the traditional cybersecurity side to make sure that we get all those perspectives that we need to come to some recommendations about, what exactly does it look like when you use blockchain in a way that actually does strengthen a cybersecurity system. And that group will have 6 months to put its research together and make some recommendations to the Blockchain Steering Committee. So yeah, I think a little bit of a broader way of thinking about blockchain, getting beyond transactions and looking at some of these use cases is I think a really good direction for us to move in when thinking about opportunities.
Thanks, Chloe. Yeah, it's really nice to think of, how the internet and technologies on the internet, enable coordination. And it's also fascinating, I think, for people to hear how the kind of a federal government, department looks to navigate those emerging technologies and that kind of process as well. Mark, I'd love to hear more about filter bubbles and some of your work on the kind of light and shade of these platforms and kind of your thoughts or assessments or takeaways.
Thanks, Kelsey. I think what Chloe just mentioned towards the end, in the sense that we need participatory design and meetings so that the community can move forward together for the greater good, is actually a good point to raise here as well. Because let's say, let's take the example, as you mentioned before, of filter bubbles. So as many of you might know, but I'll just give a quick introduction anyway. YouTube and Google and Facebook, they just want to optimize for, not for human knowledge per se, but for engagement. The more you view a video, the better it is for YouTube to monetize that video, the better it is for Google to use that, for example, to improve their advertising algorithms, for instance. Now, filter bubbles happen when, for example, let's say I were to go and look up information about coronavirus, let's say, and basically there's an article, obviously it shouldn't be trusted, about how 5G causes COVID-19, but curiosity got the better of me, so I just had to click on this YouTube video, and basically YouTube just thinks, okay, this person might be interested in these videos, let's recommend more and more and more, and sooner or later you're pretty much like Alice in Wonderland, down the rabbit hole, and yep, you start to subscribe. Maybe it's a credible theory, but that is not really a big issue, well, comparatively speaking, to echo chambers, where in echo chambers, you are convinced there's no alternative viewpoint. So there's more nefarious version of the filter bubble. So at least for the filter bubble, you can choose to, for example, exercise common sense and diversify your news sources. Instead of just viewing stuff on YouTube, actually read the newspaper, actually read what scientists have to say about the coronavirus and form a rational opinion about the whole situation. And this goes back to what I was prefacing this with, participatory governance, or including basically people, for example, government or end users or user groups or community groups in designing algorithms in the first place, would alleviate these things from happening. Just as what Chloe pointed out, if we get the community to take part in the development, because as end users, we're a diverse range of end users, we know what we want from the system, we shouldn't just let the tech giants dictate what we are to see or how we should use the product. So I think that ties in with the point of how basically participation from all sectors would be interesting in preventing the harms and promoting the good of social technical systems. On that note, I might just pass this to Marta, just to get some opinion from you about your perspective from the legal side of things. How can the law be used to advocate for like the greater good, for example, in terms of the blockchain, how it can help charities, for the internet, how it can promote free exchange of information, informed opinions, and not just putting us in filter bubbles?
Yeah, a very difficult question, Mark. But going back to the filter bubbles and echo chambers that you aptly pointed, there is a very interesting development going on that I may encourage you all to check, which is the Senate Select Committee on Foreign Interference, where there's at the moment about 30 submissions on that topic, on how foreign interference in social media platforms may raise some challenges, and incidentally it touches a lot the problem of filter bubbles and echo chambers that are facilitated by machine learning algorithms, and the use of the manipulation of social media for that purpose. So it's very interesting to see how both things, how submissions by the tech giants such as Facebook and Twitter expose what they are doing in terms of preventing manipulation, preventing those things. And it's definitely a serious effort they've been doing in removing millions of posts on COVID disinformation and so on and so forth. So this is a real effort, also using AI to prevent that. But is that enough? Probably it's not enough, because you cannot fix a problem with just better AI or better automatization, right? So definitely that's where not just law, but regulatory instruments come into place. And again, it's not just a question of state laws, federal laws, but it's probably a multi-stakeholder approach where you have different levels of regulations. Obviously, yes, practices and standards from the industry, but then ethics principles, and ultimately regulations where all stakeholders have a say and come up with solutions that are never simple. And with the blockchain is exactly the same, and because it's an even more emergent technology, the standards are not fully developed. There are many blockchains. How do they interoperate? It's not yet mature space. So we will see probably the same regulatory issues affecting the early internet now being reproduced in that space. And again, probably the only way, or the better way to solve that, is by bringing into the table different stakeholders with different views and coming up with solutions that are not the exclusive authorship of one state or one international instrument, I would say.
Can I just come in there? I'm definitely not a legal expert, but I find the role of law and regulation really interesting in relation to data and data governance generally, in that it's by nature, I think, reactive, particularly when it comes to things like, privacy and cybersecurity. It's responding to breaches and infringements on our rights and trying to pressure companies into doing better, which I think they do take on and do by and large. So it definitely has a role. I did some interviews recently with pretty senior people in Australian companies, directors and chief risk officers and CIOs. And it was really interesting. Some of them were talking about how if they want to have public trust, they actually kind of need to get ahead of the law. Because what they do now and what the law says they can get away with now might not actually be acceptable to consumers a few years down the track. So there is this other dynamic at play, which I think is also very unreliable and not a great way to build internet rights and governance, which is essentially reputation and this kind of idea of a social license to be able to use people's data, and the kind of agreements that we sign without knowing all the time when we provide personal information. So I think that there are these multiple layers of governance occurring, some which are enacted through law and are kind of responding to law, some which are much more about public sentiment and reputation and kind of corporate behaviors. But then there's this thing which is what can we actually just do better by building better technologies, by building technologies that make it really hard for people to take our data and use it in ways that we don't want to. And for me, that's I just, you know, I can't see any other way. And I hope people will, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't think the way that the world works right now is going to get us very far when it comes to good data practices or a better internet. I think that there needs to be better infrastructure and better actual technologies that handle these things in the first place, that because it's human failures that are often at fault when it comes to data breaches or bad corporate decisions and all the rest of it.
Yeah, well, it's that interplay, I guess, between the human factors in the system and then the design of the technology itself. And I think you know, multiple people now just mentioned sort of our role in shaping technology and kind of participation in technology and kind of who, you know, manages the governance of it. And that's like very strong themes in kind of the open source software communities and kind of parallels with privacy and some of the other themes touched on. I am aware of the time, and we can definitely come back to some of these themes if we're waiting for any questions during the Q&A. But I'd love to hear from each of you on kind of looking, you know, 20, 25 years in the future of the internet, and a good bit of sci-fi to help kind of frame how, you know, people and technology kind of co-adapt and develop. What do you see?
Did you say 25 years, Kelsey?
Yeah.
Wow. I would find very difficult even predict the next 5 years. But so if I may start answering the question. I have no punditry enough to ask this question, to answer this question, and we don't know how many black swans lie ahead of us that will probably disrupt some of the trends that we see now. But it's true that if we look at the figures now, for example, in Australia, it's 88% of the population is online. 70% of the population is an active user of social media, and so a lot of time of their online time is spent on social media. Compounded with the fact that the Internet of Things is growing exponentially, and billions of devices will be added to the networks, and the fact that we will have much faster networks with 5G. That again, it's not going to be deployed rapidly everywhere, but it started developing in Australia, rolling out in Australia last year. So a number of large cities have already 5G accessible, but so we will certainly have a much faster internet with billions of devices connected. And for us, that's a huge change, in the sense that our lives will be probably even more 24/7 connected to the internet via our wearable technologies, our devices, our toasters, our fridges, everything. So when it comes to privacy and cybersecurity, I don't see these becoming less of an issue, but more in the sense that we might be seeing now just the tip of the iceberg. And the more our lives move to this seamless online-offline space, the more we will have to discuss which are the governance structures for each particular domain. And so even though it's very difficult to predict how is it going to evolve, we're definitely seeing that our online, offline life will be much more blended and seamless than we see now, with all the ramifications in terms of privacy and cybersecurity.
I'm happy to go next. I agree with Marta. I think that what we now tend to think about the internet in relation to communication and information, in 25 years' time, it will be a far more material thing. It will be Internet of Things. It will be embedded into all aspects of our lives. And it will be, it will be something, I think, which will be really important in relation to governance. Internet governance will become about us as stakeholders in these various utilities and infrastructures and things that we are interacting with. So for me, there's a kind of fork in the road right now with distributed technologies. And as an optimist, I would like to say that, we currently have firms that decide how or governments that decide how our utilities or infrastructures are run, and these are going to be fundamentally different themselves in 25 years' time, and that they will probably resemble software more than the corporations that currently dominate what we think of as the internet. And maybe they will be distributed autonomous organizations.
Kelsey, can I talk about my wish list or dream in the next 20 years? And I'm just trying to be optimistic about the future. Is all right? So as I mentioned briefly before, I'd like to see more participatory development and design of the infrastructure around us, for example, in future developments of the blockchain, for instance, to restore the balance between tech companies and end users. But again, switching hats from computer science to philosophy, the philosopher Shannon Valla actually came up with a really good idea about techno-moral virtues that digital users should be aware about. The same way we have moral values, like we need to be kind to each other, we need to be helpful, we need to be compassionate. In what Val has written, we need to have certain virtues or qualities that enable us to thrive and be moral at the same time in our usage of technology. So one thing I'm just thinking on the spot, but one thing we can all adopt is, for example, critical thinking while on the internet, not just forwarding the next piece of fake news that comes by without even fact checking it. So hopefully these virtues be inculcated in the next 20 years to alleviate some of the problems we have now.
Nice. I think that that starts to somewhat address one of the questions that we've had in the Q&A, which was from RM about considering empathy in like the law and code. So I like those points, and we can come back to more on ethics. Chloe, I'd love to hear a little bit about your potential vision. And then there is a question from Sam for Chloe and or others. What role do you see DLT technologies playing in the future in Australia? So it might be nice to hear maybe some of the use cases that are being considered in the Australian National Blockchain Roadmap, and then for anyone interested, how they can kind of follow along with that process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I suppose in terms of a vision, it's quite challenging with blockchain, which has been around for just over 10 years and really only been in kind of commercial awareness for maybe 5 years or so. Trying to imagine what that looks like in 20 or 25 years' time is a huge challenge. But I agree with the points that Marta and the others made, that the existing trends since the global financial crisis and the dawn of Bitcoin, which coincided around 10 years ago or so, demands for greater transparency, the kind of concerns around, I guess, fake news and, what happens to your data, and, the kind of huge problems that we have across the economy with, identity theft and all of that happening with, insecure databases and things online. All of these different problems that we've been discussing all day. I think as we move into an increasingly digital economy, we're going to become more reliant on the internet and its underlying infrastructure. And so I think there's going to be an ongoing concern around, a really low tolerance for failure of these systems. And so people and organizations are going to be looking more and more to distributed and emerging technologies for answers and pathways out of that. In terms of blockchain particularly, I think that there is still a long way to go until we see market maturity, and it is in many cases still an experimental technology, and some of the most popular blockchains are actually quite unstable and very unpredictable things happen on them. The blockchains that are being used at the moment are very different to each other, and so very different use cases. So I think we need to have an increased blockchain literacy. So rather than specifically just focusing on technical skills, focusing on a broad understanding as a layperson or a decision maker in an executive board or in government, having some appreciation for you know, what it's good for, what it's not good for in different contexts, and how to navigate those kind of questions. And I think that's important to build trust. Coming back to this, you know, idea of trust again, I think that the lessons learned from international experience as well, from a government point of view, tell us that it's very hard to bring everyone on the journey if you're not having those open, transparent conversations, doing that participatory policy development work. And so we're going to need a lot more of that. And so coming back to Sam's question around what does that look like from a roadmap perspective, we are working as closely with industry and community as we possibly can. So some of the use cases that we're looking at, one is, as I mentioned, cybersecurity, and supply chains is a really popular one as well. That makes sense post-COVID, where we've witnessed in real time how vulnerable our global supply chains are. And it makes sense for Australia, you know, as kind of major export economy, you know, that we would want to be thinking about how we can use emerging technology to maintain our position at the productivity frontier in those sectors where we already have strengths, like in export markets, whether that's commodities exports or agricultural exports or that kind of thing. So that is actively being explored through working groups, and the government this week announced that it's making available $6.9 million in funding to bring pilots to life. And that will look at not only issues of supply chains and export markets, but it will also look at how can blockchain be used to ease compliance burden on businesses so that business efficiency is generated, and bringing the regulators into the pilot so that government has that buy-in and is part of the pilot. So that's the direction that we're moving in over the next 12, 18 months. We're also looking at credentialing. So this idea that we talked about at the start of the panel, that it's not just data and transaction data that you store on a blockchain, it's also data packets that might relate to someone's credentials or someone's, you know, identity. That's being explored as well, and other potential areas for efficiency gains when it comes to, you know, easing compliance burden. So we're really looking at this as something that's part of the recovery package to get the economy back on track post-COVID, solving problems that came to light in COVID, and those big hot topics that have come through this year, as I mentioned, around supply chains and cybersecurity and things. We are really trying to focus our efforts to make sure that they're relevant to the problems that we know that we have today. And there can be other use cases that we explore as we move through the years of this first roadmap. So obviously the finance sector, there's a huge scope of opportunity there. That is the single most popular sector or use case for blockchain that we've seen in practice. So that's a really big one. We don't currently have a working group on finance, but certainly an area where the government is paying attention. And who knows, you know, what use cases could come forward in the future. One that is quite popular for people to talk about is in health. Again, in a post-COVID context, people are kind of saying, you know, how do we share health data in a way that's really secure and actually protects privacy? And one of the things that comes up in blockchain discussions a lot is that there is a concern that because of its immutable nature, that, you know, if the wrong information gets onto a blockchain, that could be detrimental to privacy. There's also the potential for blockchain to be a privacy enhancing technology if it's used in really smart and strategic ways. So really there's kind of an endless scope of things that we could pursue, but to have a look at the priorities that we've got in the working groups that we've got at the moment, you can go to our website, which is industry.gov.au, industry.gov.au, and if you just give a little Google search to National Blockchain Roadmap, you can see who's involved in the working groups. You can get in touch with the chairs and let them know that you'd like to be a part of their consultation process, or you could get in touch with me and I can help with that as well. So I'm at digitalbusiness@industry.gov.au, and really happy to hear from anyone in the community.
Thanks, Chloe. Time for just one more question sitting in here. Keith Besgrove asks, Marta, can you tell us a bit more about what governance structures you think will be needed as technology evolves further? And I know that's a question that addresses Ellie's expertise and then even Mark's work on ethics as well. So we'll cover off as much as we can in the 5 minutes remaining, starting with Marta. Oh, she's on mute. Sorry, Marta.
Oh, sorry. I just said that very interesting question and also difficult to answer because the role of law and governance, if we think of the internet as a whole, is actually not just one technology, but many. And the models that have been operating since the last few decades have been multi-stakeholder models of governance. So it's not the object of one single jurisdiction, but multiple, and not just states, but other large NGOs and other multi-sectorial organizations. So the way that probably the emerging technologies will be also under this governance is to me looks like very similar. As I said before, it's not that with just one instrument. Think of an international treaty or another national legislation or act will both resolve the questions that new technologies will definitely raise. It's more the combination of different layers of governance and also emerging forms of governance that we are not fully aware of. If you think of all these decentralized autonomous organizations emerging in the blockchain space, they come up with new forms of governance based on tokens and voting by holding tokens in that space. So how we can is this interesting in terms of governance beyond those organizations? Probably yes, because it may help us to think new ways of liquid democracy, direct forms of democracy that are to now have not been very easy to implement, and yet with distributed technologies that might change. So I think it's quite exciting. It's good to keep an eye on what's going on in the blockchain space and other distributed technologies spaces, because that can fit up into the ways we evolve our democracies. And having said that, and just to end up with this topic that I forgot to say before, that we may have the best platforms and technologies in place, but yet the most important thing in digital democracy is the e-demos, and that's us citizens being proactive in using those platforms. It's the key question: how do we use those platforms? How we, Mark said before, how we are critical, how we fact check the information, we manage the data we deal with. It's as important as the best technological infrastructure we may have. And that's citizenship remains a very prevalent issue with emerging technologies.
I'd say that just on that matter of blockchain governance, what we're seeing occurring in the experiments that are occurring at the moment and rapidly evolving day to day is that it is one token, one vote. So those with many tokens get many votes. And so you end up with plutocracy situations, you end up with governance whales, they then sell, the whole system crashes. There are so many problems when you tie economic incentives to voting power in the way that these applications are doing. But what is also emerging are responses to that, where people are looking at different ways of designing voting and tokens that try to negate that effect. And I think that's, you know, in a very Eleanor Ostrom way, these are kind of, this is governance emergence. This is communities figuring out how to govern common resources as best they can. And I think that in, you know, probably not that too distant future, we'll have some very new and novel governance mechanisms available.
Mark, last 30 seconds. Any ways from the philosophical, ethical perspective to build empathy in to these new governance models of these kind of online, offline, hybrid kind of commons that we're hoping to build towards?
I think it goes back to the idea raised just now. In designing these systems, who's designing it and for whom, and what are we, again, to borrow from computer science, what are we optimizing for? And I think participatory design is the best way to go, getting everyone involved in the whole process, not just a particular set of stakeholders. So yep, that's the, I know that's a really quick answer, but that summarizes everything in like 30 seconds.
Beautifully done. We're right on time, so we will honor our word and wrap up. Thank you to each of you for your exceptional insights, and it's such not just a live area, but live research that you're all contributing to, or literally kind of enacting that at a national level for Chloe there in her role. So such a privilege to have you. I think it was good. A number of participants went up, not down. Which is our indicator. And yeah, thank you again to all the steering committee for NetThing for volunteering their time, and everyone for being involved.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, speakers. Don't go away straight away. We are actually having a break right now, so we'll be opening our social room, which is a Zoom meeting room, for our attendees to essentially socialize with each other and also perhaps continue this conversation with you in person as well, because I would say this session received a lot of Q&A, so there might be further conversations that attendees would like to have with speakers. So if you have a little bit more time, do join our social room. The meeting room link has just will be shared in the Zoom chat shortly. So if you enjoyed that panel, everyone, how about sharing a tweet of your thoughts using the hashtag NetThing or hashtag NetThing2020? And if you have nothing to say, that is fine, because you can also snap a selfie at our sponsored photo booth provided by GoDaddy Registry. The link will also be shared in the Zoom chat. So right now we will have a 15-minute break. So do join us if you would like to have a bit of a chat to socialize. And we will see you back here at 3:45 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time for our much anticipated final panel on censorship and expression online. Whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced? So we hope to see you soon in a couple more minutes. Thank you, everyone.